Sophie Gerber. I'm going to be presenting today on the subject of do you need to be registered with AUSTRAC? Also presenting will be Sarah Murray from our firm. So Sophie Grace is a business which was set up to assist people with licensing and compliance for the ASIC and AUSTRAC regulators to help people with maintaining and obtaining and maintaining their registration. So we've been doing this as part of a series. So this is the third part in the series. We've talked over the past 2 weeks about whether you need to get an AFSL or an ACL, which is an Australian Financial Services Licence and an Australian Credit Licence. So if you miss those two presentations, feel free to email us or email Rehan from FinTech Australia, and we'll get a copy of that through to you. We'll also be happy to answer any questions on those two presentations. For today's presentation, you can either use the question and chat box, and we'll attempt to answer those questions during the presentation. And there's also I believe there's a raise your hand function as well. So if you'd like to speak, feel free to do that as well. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing the slides and get started. Okay, so as I mentioned before, today's presentation is in relation to whether you need to be registered with AUSTRAC. And the presentation that we'll be doing next week, at the same time next week, is maintaining compliance with the ASIC and AUSTRAC compliance requirements. So the first question that people will be looking at is what is AUSTRAC? So AUSTRAC is one of the major Australian regulators. It's known as AUSTRAC, which is short for the Australian Transaction Reports and Analysis Centre. So they're a regulator which manages financial transactions, and their aim is to prevent money laundering and terrorism financing as their primary objective. They also have a supervisory and enforcement role in conjunction with a number of other regulators because of the way they receive, analyse and disseminate a lot of intelligence information that flows through their systems. So they provide this information to state, territory and law enforcement bodies. They also assist with national security, social justice and revenue enforcement. So that means that they're dealing with sending information to Centrelink, to the ATO, to the AFP, to the local police, the state police departments as well. So the rules that they operate under are known as the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Financing Act and the rules which were put in place underneath the Act. So most people refer to the Anti-Money Laundering Act as the AML-CTF Act. So that's what you'll expect to hear when you're dealing in this space. So why is AML-CTF a focus of this particular regulator? So AUSTRAC and the government has estimated that there's approximately $4.5 billion laundered in Australia every year. The figure globally, as you would expect, is much, much higher, and there's equivalent regulators around the world. So as commercial and technology developments increase, the capacity for criminals and terrorists to launder money and use laundered money for the financing of terrorism continues to increase as they find new and more sophisticated ways to wash the money through the system. So you'll see there the overarching principle as well is that entities which are meant to be regulated by AUSTRAC, they need to develop systems and frameworks that comply with AML-CTF Act, because if they don't, their business is at greater risk of being used to facilitate money laundering. So there's fines that apply to businesses and individuals that are meant to be complying but don't. So the question is, what is money laundering? So you'll see there, it involves the injection of funds generated from illegal activities into the financial system in order for criminals to hide or disguise the proceeds of crime. So a summary of the way that happens is outlined there. So they talk about it in 3 different stages. So the first stage is placement, the second stage is layering, and the third stage is integration. So what criminals and people attempting to money launder in is to get funds or assets into the financial system as the first step. And the second step is to move and disperse that money around so that it can be disguised from its original source. And then the third stage is where they've successfully done that. So where they've sufficiently distanced funds from their origins and reintroduced them back into the economy. So what you'll see there, and to give you some sort of contextual examples, is the example of, say, people talk a lot about people going down to a casino and washing the money through the pokey system or gambling it. So that's the placement stage, where people are bringing cash to a casino, and they're willing to suffer quite heavy losses in that process in order to get a check from the casino, which they can then take to the bank. So that's one that you've probably heard a lot of people suffering big losses in order to get checks out of a casino. The layering stage, this is where most businesses that we deal with are involved in preventing this. So distancing funds from their origin by moving them around, that requires people engaged in this process to be involved in opening up lots of different accounts with different financial services and credit providers, and moving the money around so that there's a long paper trail. And what AUSTRAC imposes as a primary obligation on all the entities that it regulates is that they have a significant amount of document retention and that they're collecting a lot of information off people, so that once there is this layering process, and if something goes wrong at the end, where a criminal, an individual or a business is successful in integrating the funds and eventually using them for terrorism financing, the regulators can move through the paper trail held by each business and go back to the source of where the money came from and who was involved. So terrorism financing, as you would expect, is where the use of money that may or may not be derived from criminal activity is used for financing terrorist acts. So that's terrorist acts, terrorists, or terrorist organisations. So as you see there, the key point is that the money may or may not be derived from criminal activity, but it still falls within the regulation of AUSTRAC. So that's a bit of a background as to what AUSTRAC is aiming to achieve through the regulation. And their regulation mirrors quite significantly the regulation that's been put into place around the world with most of the major economies. So you'll see there's a AUSTRAC feedback cycle, which helps to just give a bit of concept as to what AUSTRAC is doing. So you'll see there the AUSTRAC is the grey circle in the middle, where they're receiving information, first of all, from the general public, which is the orange circle at the top. They're getting information on lots of different things, including international movements of funds, and they're also receiving information from international counterparts, so similar regulators across the world. They're then disseminating that information to their partner agencies, which is what we talked about there. So you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner, in 2012 to 13, AUSTRAC contributed to 1,400 ATO cases, nearly 300 Centrelink cases, and 280 other significant investigations from partner agencies. And then you'll see there that AUSTRAC's also doing a lot of work in relation to disseminating information and giving information to the regulated population to help improve their understanding of what they're looking for, the best way to feed all the reports back, and how to understand what AUSTRAC are trying to do. So the question that you came here today to have answered is whether you need to be registered with AUSTRAC. So there's two factors that you need to consider. The first is whether there's a geographical link. And so what AUSTRAC will look at, and what you need to look at in terms of whether you need to be registered with AUSTRAC, is whether you're providing services in Australia through business premises, a branch or an office, and that can include a mobile office. Alternatively, if you're an Australian business or organisation but you're providing services through a foreign branch or foreign subsidiary. And the third is if you're a subsidiary of an Australian business or organisation and you provide services in a foreign country. So it's quite a broad net. Really, the link with Australia is quite simple to satisfy. So the first thing that you would anticipate is that if you are in Australia operating a business which has some connection here, you're most likely to get picked up by an AUSTRAC registration. And the second factor, limb, that you need to satisfy, if you've satisfied the geographic test, is the provision of designated services. So there's a list of designated services which is in Section 6 of the AML-CTF Act, and it covers a lot of different areas of the economy. So the reason why a service will have been designated in the Act is because they have been identified as posing a risk for money laundering or terrorism financing. So you'll see there, as I said before, if you have one or more designated services, which I'll show you on the next page, and you have a geographical link to Australia, which is the slide we previously talked about, you'll be considered a reporting entity and therefore need to be registered with AUSTRAC. So you'll see the list here of the more financial services related designated services, which are listed in Section 6. So many of our clients are picked up in this one here, which is the AFSL holder arranging a designated service. So that picks up people who hold an AFSL and helping their clients to receive any sort of financial product or service. The other popular one which we've seen in the last few years, especially with fintech organisations, is the currency exchange services and the digital currency exchange, as well as the stored value cards and online systems which people are using. So I'll just give you a minute to have a look at those different ones. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the box. Okay, so if you've met those two provisions, you'll need to enrol with AUSTRAC, and you'll need to enrol within 28 days of providing a service. Remittance service providers and digital currency exchange providers have an additional obligation. So there's enrolment, which is required for everybody, and registration is required for remittance and digital currency exchange providers, and those two types of services have to be enrolled and registered before they provide a designated service. So the way to register with AUSTRAC is to head to the AUSTRAC website, download and complete the AUSTRAC business profile form, and then submit that to AUSTRAC electronically. You'll also then be able to get an AUSTRAC online account, which you'll be able to use for a lot of your interactions with AUSTRAC whilst you're operating your business. So one way to find out if you're needing to be enrolled, if it's not quite clear from what we've talked about here today, is to head to the AUSTRAC website, and you'll see there one of the first boxes that they have available is a survey which you can fill in, which goes through the different parameters which you'd need to consider to determine if you need to be registered or enrolled with AUSTRAC. So lots of people ask whether they're operating a remittance or a money transfer business, and there's 3 different types of those businesses. So the first one is an independent remittance dealer, the second is a remittance network provider, and the third is an affiliate of a remittance network provider. So independent, these are, there's lots of different types of these businesses operating throughout Australia. You will have seen many of the counters and businesses probably in your local community or as you're out and about on the way to work. They're businesses which can have a storefront and they're helping people to send money overseas or to somebody else overseas. So independent remittance dealer is someone who's using their own systems, processes and independent providers to get money sent. The second is a remittance network provider. So that's some of the bigger businesses that you'll see, such as Western Union, which are using quite a number of different operators to get money sent, and involving lots of different affiliates to get money through to the end party. The third is where you are an affiliate of a remittance provider. So that's where you're providing remittance services to customers and you're involved in a remittance network. So you're receiving money from some other remittance provider, whether it's an independent remittance dealer or a network provider, and sending that money to an end party on their behalf. So the other popular one which has come into force over the last few years is the digital currency exchange. So digital currency is the term that AUSTRAC is using in their regulation for cryptocurrency effectively. So Bitcoin and some of the other more popular cryptos which have come into place. So the key thing here is that you have to be operating an exchange to fall within this definition. So you need to be helping people to exchange fiat currency, as it's known, so Australian or foreign currency in the sense that we were familiar with it before crypto came in, and swapping that for digital currency, or otherwise converting digital currency, cryptocurrency, into money. If you're assisting people simply to buy a crypto and you're not offering it on an exchange, that sort of business where you're effectively brokering will be excluded. So I'm going to hand over now to Sarah, who's going to talk you through the process of enrolling or registering a business for remittance or digital currency exchange with AUSTRAC.
So as Sophie mentioned, remittance and digital currency exchange businesses have the obligation to both enrol and register. Oh, I'll just get the sharing of the screen back up. Okay, so for remittance providers, it's mandatory for the business to satisfy one of the geographical link tests that we went through earlier. So you must enrol with AUSTRAC for that purpose, and you need to register as a remitter. So remitters must apply to appear on the AUSTRAC remittance sector register, and they must obtain registration prior to commencing to provide services in Australia. And similar process for the digital currency exchange providers. If your business is exchanging money for digital currency, it satisfies the geographical link test, you have to enrol and register the business. So it's illegal to provide digital currency exchange services to clients without being enrolled and registered. And to apply for enrolment and registration with AUSTRAC, you'll need to complete the business profile form through AUSTRAC's website. You'll also need to implement a AML-CTF program to finalise your registration with AUSTRAC. So throughout the registration process, you'll attest that you have an AML-CTF program in place, and that you'll implement those processes and procedures once the registration comes through. In some instances, AUSTRAC will ask to see a copy of that AML-CTF program, and there's some guidance on their website as to what needs to be included, but we will go through that. So reporting entities are required by the AML-CTF Act to adopt and maintain procedural documentation to address the obligations imposed under the AML-CTF Act. And the program must comply with the AML-CTF rules, and is designed to identify, mitigate and manage any money laundering and terrorism financing risks associated with the operation of the business. When developing a program, reporting entities should consider a number of factors, and this should be contained within their risk management matrix or similar document. So you'll need to consider the services that your business will be providing. You'll need to consider the types of customers you'll be providing services to, how the services will be provided, and whether your business will deal with any foreign jurisdictions. So your AML-CTF program must include procedures to identify, mitigate and manage risks. You must outline your KYC processes. There's transaction reporting obligations. So you have obligations to report international funds transfer instructions, threshold transaction reports, suspicious matter reports, and any other required reports. So an international funds transfer instruction is when you receive an instruction to transfer money overseas, or you receive an instruction to bring money into Australia from an overseas jurisdiction. A threshold transaction report is where you make a transaction that's over $10,000 or the foreign currency equivalent. And suspicious matter reports essentially entail any activities that you deem to be a bit funny or suspicious, or you think that something's not quite right. So there's no required prescriptive procedures for the SMRs, and AUSTRAC has said that they prefer entities to over-report than to under-report on their suspicious matter obligations. The AML-CTF program will also need to include an employee due diligence program. So that's the background checks and reference checks and etc. that you'll conduct on your employees, either prior to onboarding or prior to transferring them to a new position within the business. And you'll have to outline your procedures to appoint an AML-CTF compliance officer. You'll have to outline your training for AML-CTF purposes for all staff and representatives, and your record keeping obligations. So you'll also need to develop a system to monitor compliance with your AML-CTF program, including regular external compliance reviews by an independent party. And you'll also need to develop and maintain ongoing customer due diligence processes. So that includes the collection and verification of further KYC information, which includes details of beneficiaries, further transaction monitoring details, your enhanced customer due diligence program, and your transaction reporting requirements. So what happens after you obtain your registration? You'll receive a registration number from AUSTRAC, and for remittance providers, this will be publicly available on the AUSTRAC website. Digital currency exchange providers aren't currently available for public viewing on the AUSTRAC website. The registration is generally valid for 3 years and will need to be renewed after that 3 years expires. And as we've said earlier, it's an offence to provide remittance or DCE services without that AUSTRAC registration. So a case study of where AUSTRAC has been useful. So an AUSTRAC partner agency received a various number of complaints for consumers about a cold calling investment scam. And an AUSTRAC investigation revealed that a number of victims had been deceived into sending money overseas after responding to phone calls from offering offshore investment opportunities. AUSTRAC's information helped to identify the suspected Australian victims, who had sent their money overseas, and also established a method of payment and the value of funds transferred by each victim. So the amounts transferred overseas by Australian victims varied between 3,000 Australian dollars to 30,000 Australian dollars per transaction. So over a 2-month period, Australian victims lost a total of over 1 million Australian dollars to the overseas based scammers. But AUSTRAC's information enabled the regulator to alert the reporting entities being used by the victims to transfer monies to the overseas scammers to essentially help them intercept the payments before they left the Australian jurisdiction. So I'll just see if I've got any questions.
Okay, so we've had one question come through, which is wanting an explanation of being able to determine whether you are a remittance provider. If anyone else has a question that they want to send through while I'm answering this question, feel free to do so we can keep moving through the Q&As as they come through. So what we, as a general principle, suggest to people in order to determine whether they're a remittance provider is to think about it from the perspective of, if you're sending money from Australia to somewhere overseas, if the information that would be available to your bank, so whether it's, so that includes who's sending the money, as well as where the money is going to end up, who the ultimate beneficiary of the money is. If the bank doesn't have that information, then it's very likely that you're engaged in a remittance business. And that's because what AUSTRAC want as the information that they're seeking, and the reason for their registration process, is that they want to know where money's coming from and where it's going to, so that they can track the funds flow of money throughout the international economy in particular. So it goes back to our original our earlier slides, which talk about what AUSTRAC are trying to achieve. So the best way to think about it conceptually is AUSTRAC's trying to find out where money's come from and where it's going to. And the way they do that is through the funds transfer reports, which come through to them as their intelligence. So if you're engaging in a business which is going to inhibit them from finding out where money's come from and where it's going to, it's highly likely that you're going to fall within the net of being a remittance business. So I've pulled up here some of the AUSTRAC resources, which I think are quite helpful because they're really focused on this area of the economy. So you'll see on the AUSTRAC website, they have some quite helpful videos about remittance registration, and they're available in a number of different languages. And that the reason for that is because there's quite a lot of different ethnic communities throughout Australia, which rely heavily on the remittance system to get money to their family and friends in other countries. So it's worth having a look at some of the information and some of the videos that AUSTRAC have published, so you can get an understanding of whether you're involved in that type of business. I'm just going to read through a little bit more of the detail here. So some of the information which has been put in the Q&A, I'm not sure if everyone can see it, is in relation to a business that collects money from customers and then sends it through the app in relation to factoring and bill payment. So one of the first questions you'd have to ask in that business is if there's an international component. If there's not an international component involved in that that business, it's probably unlikely to be picked up as a remittance business. So I'll just show you some of the other information which is available on the AUSTRAC website, and we certainly would encourage people, if they're not able to determine from the information that's available on the AUSTRAC website and the videos that they've published, to reach out to AUSTRAC, because they're very involved and keen to be engaged with the community of people that they're regulating, to help them understand their obligations are. We find that they've been reaching out to us as well to help with understanding the types of businesses and the compliance requirements that are out there. So they're definitely looking to engage with you. So that's a bit of information based on that question which came through. If there's any other questions, feel free to put them in now. Otherwise, we're going to just let you know about our next webinar, which will be next week, same time next week, and that will be no doubt a much longer webinar because it will be talking about how to maintain your compliance with your ASIC and AUSTRAC requirements. So as I mentioned in the last 2 webinars, we talked a lot about being licensed by ASIC for financial services or credit provision, and there's a lot of compliance requirements associated with that. And as Sarah touched on today, there's a lot of compliance requirements involved with maintaining AUSTRAC registration and enrolment, which need to be considered. So we'll be talking about that next week. If you do have any questions on the AUSTRAC registration process, which we've talked about today, or the previous 2 webinars about ASIC registration and licensing, feel free to send them through either to Rayhan or directly to us. And we'll look forward to seeing some of you next week. That's all for today. So I'll stop the sharing. Thanks, everyone.